April 1945. The air over the Werra Valley is thick with the acrid scent of cordite and the damp, earthy smell of a German spring that refuses to bloom. In the small town of Hann, Münden, the silence is not peaceful, it is heavy, a suffocating blanket of anticipation. The rolling thunder of artillery has moved from a distant tremor to a constant, rib-cracking vibration in the soil. For the civilians huddled in damp cellars, the world has shrunk to the flicker of a single tallow candle and the sound of their own shallow breathing. Then, at precisely 4:15 a.m., the earth truly screams. A series of deafening concussions rocks the valley, shattering glass for miles and sending a plume of ancient stone and mortar into the gray morning sky. The retreating Wehrmacht has detonated the town's ancient stone bridge, a majestic structure that had spanned the river for centuries. As the dust settles, the residents emerge to find their lifeline severed, the jagged stumps of the piers rising from the rushing water like broken teeth. This was the scorched earth reality of the dying Reich. To the German High Command, the bridge was merely a tactical obstacle to be removed. To the mothers, the elderly, and the children left behind, its destruction was a death sentence. They were now trapped in a pocket of isolation, caught between the vengeful ghosts of their own retreating army and the approaching mechanical juggernaut of the Western Allies. The German civilians peered through the smoke toward the western treeline, fully expecting the Americans to arrive not with bread or brick, but with fire. 4 years, the propaganda of the Ministry of Public Enlightenment had painted the Americans as Kulturterroristen, culture terrorists, barbaric looters who would see German suffering as a deserved trophy of war. The bridge, they believed, would remain a ruin, a monument to their defeat and a precursor to the starvation that surely followed. They looked at the gap in the river and saw the end of their world, a chasm that separated them from safety, sustenance, and the very concept of a future. They did not yet know that the roar approaching from the forest was not the sound of a firing squad, but the arrival of a force that possessed an almost divine capacity for creation. Amidst the debris, the sound of heavy diesel engines began to drown out the fading echoes of the explosion. The first U.S. Army Scouts appeared on the ridge, their olive-drab silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. They looked down at the ruined crossing, not with the eyes of conquerors looking for plunder, but with the cold, calculating gaze of engineers measuring a problem. In the distance, the first heavy trucks of the combat engineer battalions began to crest the hill, carrying within them the massive, dark shapes of prefabricated steel. The civilians watched from behind shuttered windows, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They expected the Americans to burn what was left. Instead, the first thing the soldiers did was unload their toolkits. The era of the stone arch had ended in fire, but the age of the steel girder was about to begin, carried on the backs of men who viewed a broken bridge not as a victory, but as a job to be finished. To understand the depth of the shock that rippled through the valley, one must look at the psychological landscape of Germany in early 1945. For 12 years, the German populace had been fed a steady diet of ideological purity and racial superiority, but as the frontiers of the thousand-year Reich collapsed, that diet was replaced by a singular, potent ingredient: fear. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, had spent the final months of the war projecting their own atrocities onto the advancing Allies. Civilians were told that the Americans were not soldiers, but a mongrelized horde of gangsters and mercenaries who would treat every German village like a slaughterhouse. This was a nation that had been conditioned to believe that the loss of the war meant the literal extinction of their people. They expected the Americans to act as they themselves had acted in the East, with cold, systemic brutality and a policy of total exploitation. The destruction of the bridge at Hann, Münden was, in the minds of the locals, the final act of a tragic drama. Their own defenders had blown the span to buy a few hours of time, showing a complete disregard for the survival of the non-combatants left behind. It was a stark manifestation of the Nero decree, Hitler's order to destroy all infrastructure before it could fall into enemy hands, even if it meant the starvation of the German people. Historically, this moment represents the absolute nadir of the German civilian experience. The state that promised them glory had instead delivered them to a wasteland, and the enemy they feared was now at the gates. Factual records from this period describe a citizenry paralyzed by a defeatist gloom, where the appearance of a single American jeep was enough to send an entire street into a panic of white bedsheets hung from windows. They expected to be rounded up, to have their remaining livestock seized, and to watch as the Americans used the river as a natural barrier to keep the conquered in their place. They viewed the river not as a resource, but as a moat that would now separate them from the fertile lands to the west. The bridge was the physical embodiment of their connection to the world, and its absence felt like a permanent severance from civilization. However, the American military doctrine of 1945 was built on a foundation that the German mind could not yet fathom. The U.S. Army did not move at the pace of the horse and wagon. It moved with the unstoppable momentum of the world's greatest industrial power. While the German army had become a force of subtraction, taking lives, taking resources, and finally taking its own infrastructure, the American army was a force of staggering addition. The logistics of the U.S. Ninth Army were designed to keep the front moving, and a broken bridge was not an opportunity for punishment, but a logistical bottleneck that required an immediate engineering solution. As the heavy trucks began to reverse toward the riverbank, the civilians watched from their ruins, waiting for the first blow of the occupation. They did not realize that the Americans were carrying the weight of a different ideology, one forged in the steel mills of Pittsburgh and the assembly lines of Detroit. The bridge was gone, but the material to replace it was already arriving in a sequence of precision and abundance that would soon shatter every lie they had been told about the men in olive drab. The visual contrast on the morning of April 8, 1945, was a jarring collision of two different eras of human history. On the eastern bank, the German civilians stood as ghosts of a medieval age, gaunt, dressed in tattered wool, and clinging to handcarts filled with the meager remnants of their lives. They were a people who had learned to measure resources in grams and centimeters. On the western ridge, the arrival of the American column looked less like an army and more like an industrial city on the move. There was a terrifying vitality to the sight. Hundreds of GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks, their tires churning the spring mud into a consistent rhythm, followed by the clattering treads of M4 Sherman tanks that served as the steel vanguard. To the Germans, who had been told the United States was a hollow shell of a nation crippled by internal strife, the sheer physical presence of this equipment was a psychological blow. The Americans did not look like men who had been at war for years. Their uniforms were sturdy, their faces were well-fed, and their movements were characterized by a casual, terrifyingly efficient confidence. The sheer volume of noise was the first indicator of American abundance. The roar of thousands of horsepower, the hiss of pneumatic brakes, and the metallic clatter of heavy-duty winches. While the German army had increasingly relied on horse-drawn logistics and salvaged parts, the American machines were uniform, clean, and seemingly endless in number. As the lead elements reached the river's edge, the townspeople braced for the expected violence, but the soldiers did not even look at them with hostility. Instead, the Americans treated the civilians like part of the landscape, a background detail to the primary obstacle, the river. Then came the heavy equipment of the 1,303rd Engineer General Service Regiment. Massive cranes, their booms swaying like the necks of prehistoric beasts, began to pivot toward the water. To the German eye, accustomed to the slow, agonizing labor of manual reconstruction, the speed with which the Americans established their perimeter was incomprehensible. They watched as soldiers jumped from the trucks and immediately began unloading crates of supplies, not ammunition, but rations, medical kits, and heavy rolls of steel cable. The Americans moved with a terrifying sense of purpose that had nothing to do with the ideology of the Reich and everything to do with the reality of progress. They set up field kitchens that began to emit the scent of real coffee and frying meat, smells that had been absent from the valley for half a decade. This was the arrival of the giants, a force that possessed the luxury of being able to fix what was broken even as they pursued a retreating enemy. The civilians saw the first of the massive steel girders being winched from a flatbed trailer, a dark, heavy rib of high-carbon American steel. It hit the ground with a resonant metallic thud that seemed to signal the end of the old world. In that sound, the people of the town heard the true voice of the United States, the sound of a factory that never slept, bringing the materials of a new world to the ruins of the old. The Americans had not come to occupy a graveyard. They had come to build a road right through the heart of the nightmare. The survey began not with a speech, but with the snap of a chalk line and the sharp, rhythmic tap of hammers against masonry. A young American lieutenant, his uniform smeared with the grease of a dozen motor pools, stood at the water's edge with a transit level, peering through the lens at the jagged remains of the stone piers. The German civilians, huddled in the doorways of their skeletal homes, watched with a mixture of dread and bewilderment. They expected the Americans to build a simple wooden raft to ferry tanks across, a temporary, selfish solution to keep the war moving eastward. But as the engineers moved, it became clear that they were preparing for something far more permanent. The soldiers didn't just measure the gap. They cleared the rubble with the practiced ease of men who had done this from North Africa to the Rhine. They treated the ruined German bridge as a canvas for American industry. The first steel girder was swung into place by a motorized crane, its shadow lengthening across the muddy banks. This was a Bailey Bridge component, a miracle of British design and American mass production. It was a lattice of high-tensile steel, prefabricated to withstand the weight of a 40-ton tank or a 10-ton truck laden with flour. For the Germans watching, the sight of the steel was a revelation. In the waning months of the war, German steel had become a rare, precious commodity, diverted entirely to the production of Tiger tanks and V-2 rockets. To see it used here, in a small town, to rebuild a civilian crossing, was an affront to everything the Nazi Party had taught them about the scarcity of resources and the decadence of the West. The Americans weren't just fixing a road. They were deploying a level of material wealth that felt like a deliberate psychological assault. Every bolt tightened and every pin hammered into the steel frame was a statement. The engineers worked through the night under the glare of portable floodlights, a luxury of electricity that the town had not seen in years. The hum of the generators was the heartbeat of this new occupation. While the German army had demanded that the civilians sacrifice their lives for the soil, the Americans were using their own steel to mend the soil for the civilians. The gap in the river was narrowing, and with every foot of progress, the wall of propaganda in the minds of the townspeople began to crumble. They saw that the American soldier was not the vengeful monster of the radio broadcasts, but a man who carried a wrench as often as a rifle. The survey was complete, the foundations were set, and the first span of the steel bridge reached out toward the eastern bank like an olive branch made of industrial iron. The townspeople realized then that the bridge was not being built to bypass them, but to include them. The American abundance was not a myth. It was a physical weight, cold and heavy, being lowered into the river to hold the world together. The river had always been the heartbeat of the town, and the stone bridge its spine. For centuries, the people of Hann, Münden had walked those arches to reach the mills, the markets, and the neighboring villages that held their families together. It was a structure built on the endurance of the past, a symbol of German stability that had survived the Napoleonic Wars and the industrial revolutions of the 19th century. But in the spring of 1945, that sense of permanence had been incinerated. The destruction of the bridge was not merely a tactical maneuver by the retreating Wehrmacht, it was a psychological amputation. As the townspeople looked at the jagged stumps of stone protruding from the rushing water, they were seeing the physical manifestation of the collapse of the German state. The Endsieg, the promised final victory, had left them with nothing but broken masonry and isolated hunger. The bridge had been their way into the world, and now that world was closed. In the silence of the aftermath, Before the Americans had fully established their presence, the elders of the town stood by the bank, mourning a loss that felt ancient. They remembered the bridge as it was in their childhoods, a place of parades and Sunday strolls, now reduced to a hurdle for foreign tanks. This was the brutal irony of the Nazi regime. It had promised 1,000 years of German greatness, but had left the German people unable to cross their own rivers. The civilians reflected on the promises of their leaders, who had spoke of Lebensraum and vast empires while failing to protect the simple infrastructure of a local village. The contrast was agonizing. They were a culture that prided itself on order and engineering, yet their own soldiers had been the ones to bring the dynamite. As the American engineers moved about with their strange, heavy equipment, the townspeople felt a profound sense of dislocation. They were witnessing the death of one era of German identity and the birth of something they could not yet define. The river, once a friend, had become a wall, and the silence of the broken bridge was a reminder of their complicity in a war that had finally come home to roost. Yet, as they watched the first steel girder hover over the chasm, the reflection changed. They saw that the Americans did not view the river with the same romantic or nationalistic fervor. To the men in olive drab, the river was simply a problem to be solved with logistics and metal. The American presence was stripping away the myth of the master race and replacing it with the reality of the master mechanic. The townspeople realized that while their own leaders had used the bridge as a pawn in a losing game of chess, the Americans were treating it as a vital organ in a living body. The sorrow for the old stone began to give way to a cautious, desperate hope for the new steel. They were learning that a bridge does not belong to a government or an ideology. It belongs to the people who need to reach the other side. In the shadow of the American cranes, the civilians began to understand that the liberators were not there to erase their history, but to provide the physical means for them to survive it. The ancient stones lay dead in the mud, but the American girders were reaching out, offering a cold, metallic promise that the town would not be left to rot in the ruins of the Reich. The labor that unfolded on the banks of the Werra was a symphony of industrial synchronization. To the German civilians, who had been mobilized for total war, only to find themselves digging trenches with shovels and carrying stones by hand, the American method of work was a revelation. It was the language of the machine age, spoken with a fluency that bordered on the miraculous. Factual records of the U.S. Army's engineering feats during this push toward the Harz Mountains reveal a staggering rate of progress. The combat engineers were capable of erecting a 150-foot Bailey Bridge in less than 7 hours. The Americans did not rely on the desperate, forced labor of the conquered. They relied on the raw power of their equipment and the specialized skill of their personnel. Each soldier had a specific role, moving with a rhythmic efficiency that made the construction site look like a well-oiled assembly line shifted from a Detroit factory to the German mud. The recurring sound of the work, the heavy, rhythmic clang of the steel girder hitting the pins, became the new heartbeat of the town. This was the material reality of democracy, a system that could mass-produce complex, interchangeable parts and transport them halfway across the globe to mend a river in a village that most of the soldiers could not even pronounce. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as the Americans utilized pneumatic drills and motorized winches, tools that were virtually non-existent in the depleted German civilian sector. There was no shouting, no frantic gesturing of officers, only the steady, confident hum of men who knew exactly how to master the physical world. The civilians noted that even the lowest-ranking American private seemed to possess a level of technical autonomy that was forbidden under the rigid hierarchy of the Reich. This was the arsenal of democracy, in its most humanitarian form. The sheer abundance of supplies was incomprehensible. If a bolt was stripped or a cable frayed, it was not salvaged or repaired with wire. It was discarded and replaced with a brand-new part from an endless crate. The Americans possessed such a surplus of material that they could afford to be perfect. As the sun reached its zenith, the skeleton of the bridge was already reaching across the water, a geometric web of dark metal that contrasted sharply with the jagged, ancient ruins beneath it. The Germans realized that the war they had been fighting was not just a conflict of soldiers, but a conflict of production. They had been told that American capitalism was a chaotic, decaying system, yet here was the proof that it could organize and execute a complex engineering feat with more precision than the most disciplined Prussian regiment. The bridge was not just a crossing. It was a physical manifestation of a logistical superiority so absolute that it rendered the very idea of resistance absurd. The townspeople began to see that the American abundance was not a myth designed to demoralize them, but a tangible, heavy fact that was currently being bolted together to save their lives. The language of labor was translating the harsh reality of defeat into the first tentative steps of a reconstruction they had never dared to imagine. As the skeleton of the bridge spanned the divide, the psychological distance between the conqueror and the conquered began to narrow in ways that no pamphlet could achieve. A group of German children, drawn by the irresistible spectacle of the machinery, had ventured out from the shadows of a burnt-out bakery. They stood in the mud, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hunger, watching a corporal from the 1303rd as he guided a massive steel girder into its final housing. To these children, a soldier was a figure of absolute authority who took things away: fathers, brothers, and bread. They expected the American to bark an order or drive them back with a bayonet. Instead, the corporal reached into the pocket of his field jacket and pulled out a small, rectangular object wrapped in waxed paper. It was a Hershey's bar, part of a standard K ration, but in the ruins of 1945 Germany, it was a relic from a different world. He didn't make a gesture of pity. He simply tossed it to the oldest boy with a casual nod and went back to his wrench. The chocolate, rich with milk and sugar that had been absent from the German diet for years, was the sensory proof of the American myth. It was the taste of an economy so vast that even its front-line soldiers carried luxuries in their pockets. This small interaction was a microcosm of the larger ideological shift occurring on the riverbank. The townspeople, watching from their windows, saw that the Americans did not need to use violence to assert their dominance. Their dominance was built into the very fabric of their gear, their food, and their casual generosity. The emotional contrast was devastating to the remaining vestiges of Nazi pride. The town had been told the Americans were soulless machines. Yet here they were, sharing their surplus with the children of the enemy. The bridge was becoming more than a military necessity. It was becoming a site of cultural reconciliation. The Germans saw that the American concept of victory was fundamentally different from their own. It was not a victory of subjugation, but a victory of restoration. Every time a soldier checked a measurement or secured a bolt, he was reinforcing the idea that the American presence was intended to stabilize, not destroy. The civilians began to realize that the fear they had carried was a phantom created by a dying regime to keep them compliant. The reality was standing before them in olive drab, smelling of tobacco and diesel, building a path for them to walk on. The ideological gap was being bridged by the simple, repeated clanging of steel on steel, a sound that drowned out the echoes of the Horst Wessel-Lied and replaced it with the pragmatic rhythm of reconstruction. They were witnessing the power of a nation that could afford to be kind because it was overwhelmingly strong. The children, sitting on the muddy bank and sharing the chocolate, were the first to cross the invisible line of the war, moving from the darkness of a paranoid empire into the bright, bewildering light of an American-led future. The steel above them was cold and hard, but the hands that moved it were surprisingly human, and in that realization, the war for the hearts of the townspeople was won before a single civilian had even set foot on the new planks. By late afternoon, the structure had taken on its final, formidable shape. The Bailey Bridge, a lattice of high-tensile American carbon, sat upon the riverbanks like a modern industrial cathedral. The installation of the main spans was the most dangerous phase of the operation, requiring the engineers to push the entire assembled structure out over the water using a series of massive rollers. The recurring symbol of the steel girder was never more prominent than in this moment. To the German civilians watching, the weight of the steel represented more than just a physical load. It was the literal weight of an ideology. For years, the Nazi state had claimed that its strength was derived from the blood and soil of the German people, yet that state had proven unable to protect its own infrastructure. In contrast, the American strength was derived from the factory and the assembly line, a strength that was now being used to support the lives of those it had just defeated. The townspeople marveled at the sheer mass of the components. Each 10-foot section of the bridge was a marvel of uniformity, designed to be assembled by hand if necessary. But here it was being moved by the effortless power of hydraulic cranes. This was the crushing reality of American logistics, a system so over-engineered that it could afford to build a permanent grade crossing in a temporary war zone. The civilians noted the lack of desperation in the American work. There was no frantic shouting or the lash of an overseer. There was only the steady, confident clanging of heavy wrenches and the rhythmic hiss of air compressors. As the final span reached the eastern bank, the sound of the steel meeting its housing was a resonant, low-frequency thud that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of the town's elders. They understood then that the decadent West had not only outproduced the Reich, but had outthought it. The American bridge was not a fragile or temporary thing. It was a testament to the industrial capacity of a nation that could transform raw ore into a tool of salvation in a matter of hours. The weight of the steel was the weight of a new world order, one that valued the flow of goods and people over the purity of the soil. As the engineers began to lay the heavy wooden decking over the steel ribs, the hollow sound of footsteps on the planks signaled the completion of the impossible. The river, which had been a barrier of despair just 24 hours earlier, was now a gateway. The American girders stood as silent, silver sentinels over the water, holding up the literal and figurative weight of the town's future. The civilians realized that they were no longer looking at an enemy's construction site. They were looking at the first solid ground they had stood upon since the war began. The steel was cold to the touch, but it provided a warmth of security that the stone of the past had failed to sustain. The bridge was finished, and the weight of the occupation had suddenly shifted from the threat of the sword to the promise of the plowshare, all supported by the unyielding strength of American iron. The sun began its descent behind the western ridges, casting long geometric shadows of the new structure across the churning river. The construction was complete. What had been a jagged wound in the landscape only hours before was now a masterpiece of functional industrialism. There was no formal ribbon-cutting, no grand speech by a high-ranking general. The Americans did not have time for the theatricality that had defined the Third Reich. Instead, the young lieutenant who had surveyed the ruins simply waved a grease-stained hand toward the eastern bank. The first crossing was not a column of tanks, but a single horse-drawn civilian wagon, belonging to an elderly farmer who had been stranded with a load of firewood. The horse hesitated at the edge of the new wooden planks, its ears twitching at the unfamiliar scent of fresh-cut pine and American diesel. But as the farmer urged the animal forward, the bridge held with a supernatural stillness. There was no swaying, no groan of overstressed timber. The steel girder skeleton absorbed the weight with the silent indifference of superior engineering. The German civilians, gathered in a silent semicircle on both banks, watched the crossing with an intensity that bordered on the religious. For them, this was the physical moment of surrender, not a surrender to a conqueror's sword, but to a conqueror's utility. As the wagon reached the center of the span, the farmer looked down at the American soldiers standing on the piers below. He didn't see the beasts described by the radio broadcasts in Berlin. He saw tired men in olive drab who were already packing their tools, preparing to move to the next broken town, the next ruined river. This was the transformation of an entire town's ideology, occurring in the space between two riverbanks. The bridge was the first piece of solid ground in a world that had been liquid with chaos for years. It was a path that led away from the Götterdämmerung of the Nazi collapse and toward a future that was, for the first time, predictable. The townspeople began to move toward the bridge, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. They touched the cold, dark steel of the railings as they passed, as if to convince themselves that it wasn't a mirage. The Americans had not just rebuilt a road, they had restored the concept of the other side. They had proven that the power which had destroyed their armies was the same power that could sustain their lives. The first crossing was a quiet, dusty procession of the defeated walking across the handiwork of the victors, and in that crossing, the war in Hann, Münden, truly ended. The river was no longer a moat of isolation, it was an artery of the coming peace. As the farmer's wagon cleared the eastern ramp and rolled onto the firm soil of the town, a low murmur of conversation finally broke the silence of the valley. The bridge had held. The Americans had helped. And the steel, forged in the fires of a distant democracy, now stood as the only thing keeping the town from falling into the abyss of history. The shadows of the American engineers grew long as they finally loaded the last of their tools into the idling trucks. The bridge stood illuminated by the pale moonlight, a geometric skeleton of high-tensile carbon that seemed to vibrate with the quiet energy of a new world. This single point of transit, forged from the recurring strength of the steel girder, was a microcosm of the tectonic shift that had occurred across the European continent. In the ruins of the Third Reich, where every monument had been dedicated to the gloriation of the state, the Americans had built a monument to the survival of the individual. The civilians of Hann, Münden, watching the last of the olive-drab columns move toward the horizon, were no longer the same people who had huddled in the cellars 48 hours earlier. They had witnessed the true miracle weapon of the Western Allies, not a bomb or a rocket, but an industrial capacity fueled by the logistics of freedom and an abundance that could afford to be merciful. The bridge was more than a crossing over the Werra. It was a physical rejection of the ideology of scarcity and destruction. It stood as proof that democracy did not arrive merely to occupy the land, but to restore its breath. While the Nazi regime had used the landscape as a weapon of war, the Americans had used their steel to heal the geography of peace. The poetic truth of 1945 lay in these temporary structures, these Bailey bridges that were stronger than the stone empires they replaced. They served as the literal foundations for the Marshall Plan, the physical manifestations of a belief that a stable neighbor is a safer friend than a conquered subject. The townspeople, now crossing the river with their carts and their children, were participating in the first quiet acts of a democratic future. They were walking on American steel, breathing American air, and beginning to understand that the abundance of the West was not just a material fact, but a moral one. The river continued to flow beneath the spans, indifferent to the wars of men, but the bridge above it remained, a cold, unyielding promise that in the struggle between the creators and the destroyers, it is the builders who ultimately inherit the earth. The ruins of the old world were still visible in the mud, but the road leading out of them was made of iron, and it led toward a horizon where the only thing being manufactured was hope.